Hey everyone, it's Mark from Flight Sim School, and today we're going to be continuing the flight that we started in the previous episode, where we're going to learn everything that we need to know about flying on Airways with traditional navigation, as well as review how to fly an ILS without a GPS. If you're completely unfamiliar with traditional navigation, I really recommend that you watch part 2 before watching this one, because you need to understand those basics for everything that we're going to look at today to make sense. And if you want to learn how to plan your own non-GPS routes as well, you can check out part 1, but otherwise we can just get going. In the last video, we took off from Torrance just to the south of LAX, and we learned how to fly to and from the Santa Monica VOR on 2 different courses, and we're going to pick up right where we left off, flying away from the Santa Monica VOR on the airway that runs west from it. You can think of an airway much like a highway. It's a predefined route on the chart that makes it easier to keep spacing between planes, and it allows us to get from one airport to the other, although not always in a very direct way. Every airway has a few things in common though that you're going to see on every chart. Most notably, it's going to have a name on a black background, so this one is called V107, and below that we've got the minimum altitude in flight levels that we need to fly at when we're on that airway. This one says flight level 050, which means that we need to be at a minimum of 5,000 feet. An airway can be split up into multiple segments, and the numbers above the airway tell us the distance in miles for each one of those segments, which are split up by little triangle waypoints along the airway. So from the Santa Monica VOR to the based waypoint, it's 10 miles, and then from based to SAD, that leaves us another 5 miles for our total distance of 15 miles from Santa Monica all the way to SAD. Probably the most important bit of information on the airway though is what tells us how to actually stay on it. And if we zoom in on our starting point at Santa Monica, you can see that it's actually telling us we need to fly the 261 course from the Santa Monica VOR to stay on the airway. So in the plane, we've got our nav1 radio still set to the Santa Monica VOR, and we told the DHSI that we want to fly the 261 course from the station by just rotating the OBS knob, and we can see that our yellow course deviation indicator at the center of the HSI is pretty much right down the middle of it, which means that we're effectively on the airway already, and we're about 7 miles out from Santa Monica. We need to start preparing for our next segment once we get to that waypoint though, which is going to bring us northbound towards our approach. So let's just head back into Navigraph one last time to look at all of that. Airways always run to and from VORs, but that doesn't mean that there's a VOR at the end of every airway. And what can happen is that some waypoints, like SAD here, are an intersection point between 2 different VORs. There are then 2 different ways that you can know when you've reached a waypoint like this. The easiest is to just use your DME to tell how far you are from the VOR, and we know that we have to travel 15 miles to get to SAD from Santa Monica. So once our DME readout says 15 miles, we'll know that we've reached that waypoint. The other way that you can do it is to use your nav1 and your nav2 radios to pinpoint your position from the 2 different VORs, and we're actually going to combine this technique with the first one to jump from one segment to the next and sort of cut out the corner to make it into a nice smooth transition. Let's see what that looks like in action. Our nav1 radio is what we're using to stay on our current airway segment, and we need to keep flying on it until we get to SAD. So I'm going to use the nav2 radio instead so that I can tell when we're coming up on that next airway segment. Like we just saw in Navigraph, that airway segment runs up to the Fillmore VOR, and before we took off, I tuned the nav2 radio to 112.5 so that we can pick up the signal for it. So that really just leaves us with our course that we need to figure out. Just like for the first segment of the airway, there's no guesswork to figuring out what course we need to fly, because all of that is available if we just zoom in on the starting point where we're going to be joining the airway segment. And the course that we need to fly for this one is right there, which is 328. We're going to be using the nav2 to track that VOR, so we need to twist the OBS knob on the nav2 as well and set it to 328. And I actually set all of this up before takeoff so that I didn't have to fiddle with the radios during the flight, which is why it's already set. We're already picking up the signal from that VOR because the needle is deflected to the left. And to understand why it looks like that, you have to remember that the course needle is always showing you where the flight path is relative to the course that you've told it you want to fly. In our case, we said we want to fly the 328 course northbound to the Fillmore VOR. So if I were to turn the plane to a heading of 328 right now, the course would show as if it's to our left, which is why it's showing like it is right now. Since all of that's already set up, all I've got to do at this point is keep flying the 261 course from the Santa Monica VOR on our nav1 until the nav2 needle starts to center itself, because at that point we'll be getting close to our switchover point where I'm going to stop using the nav1 data that's being shown on the HSI and I'll use the nav2 data to navigate instead. We're going to get back to the flying in just a second, but I want to remind you to like the video so that others can find it and learn all about traditional navigation like you are right now. And make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on the rest of this analog IFR series, because we're really only just getting started here. Alright, our DME just clicked up to 11 miles, so we're getting close to the end of this airway segment. And if you look closely, you can see that the course needle on the VOR2 indicator is slowly starting to move towards the center of the instrument, which means that we're coming up on our switchover point where we're going to go from the airway that we're on right now from Santa Monica to the one that's going to go up towards the Fillmore VOR. The VOR2 indicator works almost exactly like the HSI. The vertical course deviation indicator still represents our flight path, and right now it's to the left of us, which means that we need to stay on a course that's to the left of 328 to bring it back towards the center. And as it gets closer and closer to the middle, we need to start turning more towards our course that we're trying to fly. And I'll usually start turning towards that new course when it's about halfway, like it is right now. Timing these turns to roll out just on course is a little bit of an art, but with practice you can get pretty good at it. Although the way that I do it, as you've seen so far, is I just shallow up my intercept angle progressively until I get closer and closer to where I need to be, and then I'll just make small corrections left or right until I'm right on course. Anytime we change our course, it's a good idea to double check our nav instruments, and this time it's even more important because the nav2 indicator isn't an HSI, so it's very easy to end up in a situation where you're going the wrong way without even realizing it. Right now our course is set to 328 and our heading is now about 300 degrees, so we're heading generally in the same direction as our course, and as we get closer and closer to the course we'll turn more and more towards 328, so we're all good there. Our to from indicator is pointing up as well, meaning that it's a course that's going to take us to the VOR, which again makes sense because we're heading north towards the Fillmore VOR. So it looks like everything's all good, and we just need to finish lining ourselves up properly on the airway. Our VOR2 needle is just about centered already, so we're almost on course, and what I've been doing is just like we did in the previous video to fly to a VOR, and I've slowly brought my heading back to 328 as the needle's gotten closer and closer to the center of the instrument, and then I just made small adjustments until it's right down the middle of it. It's just about there now, so it's probably a good point to brief our approach, which is going to be the ILS 2 runway 25 in Oxnard. Our initial approach fix that we're using is the Guyby waypoint, and the reason for that is that it's on the airway that we're currently flying up, so we're going to cross it without having to do anything else, and at that point it's going to be just really easy to switch to the ILS's inbound course as we fly by it, and it's going to be the exact same thing we've been doing so far. There are a few altitudes that we need to watch out for to avoid some of the terrain in the area though, and until we get to Guyby, we need to maintain our 5,000 feet cruising altitude on this airway segment, but as soon as we start our turn towards the final approach course, we can slowly start to descend to about 4,200 feet, and by then we should be picking up the glide slope anyways. Now, since we're using nav2 to align ourselves on the new airway, we don't need the information that's being shown on nav1 anymore, so I can reuse that frequency to track our next and final leg of the flight, which is going to be the ILS for the runway. I'd set up the frequency for the ILS into the standby before takeoff, so now all I have to do is swap the frequency in. And that's telling us now that we're tracking a localizer signal, which is what we want. And to make sure that we fly it correctly, and just like with every other course change that we've done so far, we also need to set our course on the HSI correctly as well. And this time it's a final approach course of 256 degrees. And with that set, we can see that the final approach course is somewhere ahead of us on the HSI. So for now, I'm just going to stay on our airway by keeping the VOR2 centered. And I'm going to wait for the HSI to start centering itself exactly like we've done on previous legs. Once you're used to flying with VORs, flying an ILS approach becomes pretty standard because the concepts are exactly the same. The main difference is that the localizer signals are a lot more sensitive left or right than a VOR is, and you're going to notice also that you don't have a to from indicator because the ILS signal only works in one direction, so you definitely want to make sure that you've got your arrow pointing at the right inbound course for the approach. The extra complexity of the ILS is of course that you have to descend on the glide slope as well as configure the airplane for landing at the same time. And when you can't see where you're going like we can't today because there's a little bit of cloud coverage, it does definitely increase the difficulty level because you need to rely entirely on your instruments. Okay, so our final approach course of 256 is starting to move towards the center of the HSI, so I can start my turn towards that heading now. And this works exactly like trying to fly a course to or from a VOR. When it comes to the ILS though, the yellow CDI needle really just represents an extended runway centerline all the way out to where we are. And our goal, just as always, is to keep it centered in the HSI. So if the CDI ends up to the left of center on the HSI, like it looks like it's doing right now, then I need to turn in that direction to bring it back towards the center, and then slowly come back to my final approach course as it recenters itself. Flying a localizer and a glide slope completely manually is a lot of work though, so in the Comanche I use the autopilot in high track mode to fly the localizer, and like that it'll take care of going left or right for me, and all I have to worry about is making sure that I'm flying the glide slope properly. Normally an ILS approach is also going to have a DME so that you can tell how far out you are from the runway, but this one doesn't for some reason. However, it does have a glide slope which is shown on the HSI to the left. The way the glide slope works is that you have to imagine your plane is right at the center of the dial, and the yellow indicator represents the ideal glide path that we need to be on. Right now, the yellow indicator is above the middle of the dial, which means that we're below the ideal glide path. So I'm going to hold our altitude until the indicator reaches the center of the instrument, and then at that point I'm going to start descending, and I'll do my best to keep it centered by adjusting my descent rate accordingly so that we stay on track all the way below the clouds. If you need more information about how to fly the ILS, I've covered it in depth in the past, once using the G1000 as well, once without, so I'll have links in the description of the video for you. To make things easier on your first try at doing this, I really recommend that you turn the wind off for starters and turn off the clouds as well, so that you can always use ground references in case you get lost, because it does take a little bit of time to get the hang of doing this properly. But once you feel up to it, definitely try it in overcast conditions, because breaking out of the clouds and seeing runway lights up ahead of you is probably one of the most satisfying things I've ever done in flight sim. The key thing though that I want you to take away from these first 3 traditional navigation videos is that preparation and staying ahead of the airplane are really the keys to success with traditional navigation. Otherwise, you're just going to struggle to keep up, and it's going to lead to frustration, and it just won't be very enjoyable. And if you've made it to this point in the video, you've likely learned a thing or two along the way. So I'm going to ask that you please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe on your way out so that you don't miss out on the next video of our analog IFR series.